ALN for 36 years. Jack?
Thanks, Nick. It's those of you who've been paying attention to the Asset Leadership Network for the past several years will remember maybe that last year we created a document called the National Asset Leadership Strategy, and that was in 2019. We called it the NALS for short. This year, we've evolved to what we're now calling the National Asset Leadership Success Strategy for 2020. And that's based, the reason we added success in there is because asset management is all about organizations achieving their results through the effective management of their assets. And so we consider achieving an organization's results to be success. And so we thought success would be a nice addition to the title of our initiative. So we're going to be here today talking about what we're calling the Sector Asset Leadership Success Structure. And the term sector is important because as we were thinking about how best to implement this national strategy, we realized that a lot of the organizations that are in charge of the policies related to asset management actually are organized around sector. So that's what led us down this path. But I want to introduce some colleagues from Grant Thornton who've been part of the National Asset Leadership Strategy since the very beginning last year. And the team that's been working with us this past year is going to tell you more about what we've evolved to. And first I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Schneider, who will take us away.
Great. Yep. Thanks for the introduction, Jack. And appreciate you and the ALN team for inviting us to speak today. So my name is John Schneider. I'm manager with Grant Thornton, working in our asset management group, and happy to be back speaking with ALN. So the purpose of today and what I'll be walking you through, and my colleagues from GT, is a document that has two different parts. The first we'll go through fairly quickly, provide some more backgrounds and context on our work last year around the National Asset Leadership Strategy. And the second part we'll go through a little bit more detail, includes a lot of guiding questions and principles to support the development of what we're calling here on the screen, the Sector Asset Leadership Success Structures. So I'll click through here, these slides. So here's just for a little bit more background. So for those who are new to this effort, the sector plans, like Jack mentioned, so this slide provides a little bit more background and gets to the point what Jack was talking about. These sector plans are a continuation of the NALS process from last year that set up a framework for us. And the sector plans is the next step, and we're going to dig deeper into each section. And those plans really evolve over time, but are based on the foundation set by the NALS and the foundation set by ISO 55000. So this slide here really just provides a little more background on the effort. And I'll go through the next few a little quickly so we have some time to dig into the other slides in a little bit more detail. It's really all based around the management system standards, the ISO 55001. And we end this, really thinking, why would we want to adopt the ISO 55001? And it really comes to these benefits that we identified. And so we've identified these few benefits, from informed asset investment decisions to managing risk, to improve stakeholder engagement, better lifecycle asset management. And the goal here is to really have, these are the benefits of the system. We want to make sure that these are integrated into all the sector plans. And so kind of taking a step back and looking at the NALS 2019, it was delivered to, as you'll see on the slides here, delivered to members of several committees and organizations. And we really want to build on that success and that achievement from last year and develop these sector plans and to be able to deliver those to the same individuals and groups this fall. So I know we kind of talked about two different things, and it kind of gets back to the two thrusts of this effort. And the first being the higher level NALS National Asset Leadership Success Strategy document, which will continue to provide build on last year's documents and provide that high level approach to developing a national approach to asset management. And what we're really focused on here today, that second point, is the Sector Asset Leadership Success Structures. And it takes these general policy guidances and extends more focus to the sector levels. So going here to the next slide. So in developing this, we really focused on a few sectors that we found to be important to build out. And if you participated in some of the webinars in the last few weeks with ALN, you'll see these are the same sectors that were discussed throughout the different events. And so these are the ones that we really think would be beneficial to have a more detailed sector plan developed. So really the purpose of these sector plans, getting back to it, I think this bottom one is really the main benefit of it, is using the standards as a proven basis for improvement. And so that's what it really all comes back to, is using the standards of ISO 55000 and then now to kind of dig a little bit deeper into each of these sectors. And it's kind of on top of that is tying that to what we identified as some of the national asset leadership sector objectives. So if you look on the screen here, these 5 objectives are what we really saw as the main purpose of the sector plans. So our hope is that each sector can use the questions that we'll go over later in this document to really meet these objectives and kind of tie everything back to meeting these 5 key objectives of asset leadership. So that's kind of wraps up the first part of this document. It really provides some context and overall background on the whole effort to kind of understand how the sector plans are really building on the work the ALN has done so far with the asset leadership strategy and ISO 55000. It's really that next step in the process to kind of dig into each of these sectors. So I'll walk through a few of the first questions here, then I'll hand off to Spence to kind of continue going through it. So we thought it'd be best to start with kind of the highest level. So we start with defining the sector and understanding the scope and responsibilities of the sector and really the scale. For example, we were talking about this morning, in the law enforcement community, understanding the importance of fleet management has within that community, understanding, the financial impacts decisions within that sector can have on the community. So really upfront defining what the sector is, what's the scope of responsibility, and what's the scale. And then from there, moving to the objectives. So what are the main objectives of this sector? So I know earlier in the slides, we had the overall asset leadership objectives, but here, as you see in the example of water, what are the key objectives within this sector? And kind of laying that out up front and understanding that, that as you build out a sector structure. So I hope that provided a little bit more context on what the sector asset leadership structures would be. I'll hand it off to Spence here, and he'll continue to walk through the document.
Hey, everybody, I'm Spence. I'm an associate that works in the asset management team. So the current state, these are the current state questions, and these questions regard the sector at this point in time. So how well are these assets in this sector achieving their national objectives? What are the most pressing problems in these sectors that are being faced, and what problems are most pressing in the current time right now? And also, what are the strengths currently that these sectors have? Also, we want to find out what reports and or scores are each sector receiving so we can grow on those. These current state questions provide a starting point for each sector to work from, providing a beginning baseline in the creation of their sector plan. Can you get the next slide, please, John? So these are the boundary questions. So we're focusing on the laws and regulations that impact and guide each sector in decisions making and actions. But we can't solely focus on the boundaries from the laws and regulations. We need to also focus on what other boundaries there are and the importance of those boundaries. So for example, what sectors overlap in reference to the SALs and the importance of these overlaps when creating sector plans. Next slide, please. So now here are the questions of scope of assets supporting these objectives. So what categories of assets are included? We will look at a taxonomy graphic for a better visualization of asset categories in the next slide, but this visualization will determine the type, the category, kind of asset, and who owns or controls these assets. So you don't mind going to the next slide, John? So here's our taxonomy graphic. So what do we mean when we talk about assets? So ISO 55000 asset management standard defines an asset as an item, thing, or entity that has actual or potential value to an organization. So developing a national asset leadership strategy requires agreement on characteristics or qualities that best describe the nation's assets. So this encompasses the breadth of assets, asset types, which are all encompassing. Our taxonomy graphic allows everyone to understand and agree on using this taxonomy in the creation of the sector plans. So the stakeholder interest in these objectives and assets. We need to define the stakeholders involved and how stakeholders will be included in the development of each sector document. In reference to stakeholders, we also need to be aware of how we will address the social responsibility of each sector while creating effective sector plans. So in reference to the stakeholder questions, here's a stakeholder graphic we developed. As defined by ISO 55000, a stakeholder is a person or organization that can be affected by, or perceive themselves to be affected by decision or activity. The National Asset Leadership Success Strategy will impact assets owned or operated by, or under the influence of, multiple public and private sector entities. Stakeholders inform national objectives and how assets support those objectives. Here we identify the relevant stakeholders that affect the national objectives and the asset support of those objectives. The stakeholders include public sector entities such as Congress, as well as federal, state, and county agencies, but it also includes the private sector entities like contractors, investors, the media, and academia. So we need to take these taxonomies into account so to not forget who and what areas each sector affects when creating an effective sector plan. I'm going to now turn it on over to Ed to finish up the presentation.
Thanks, Spence. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ed Safdie, and I joined Grant Thornton about 16 months ago after almost 36 years in the Department of Veterans Affairs, where I principally served as a healthcare engineer and in construction and facilities management. So as we go through this, I'm going to look at it through the lens of a healthcare engineer and provide some practical, concrete examples of how the questions could be answered. So what are the objectives? We want to provide safe and efficacious healthcare. That's our objective. And there are two large categories of asset management in healthcare. One is the facilities or infrastructure, and the other is the personal property, all the equipment, all the medical equipment. It's important to remember that with ISO 55K, we can divide and conquer by picking an asset group that we want to achieve better results for. If any of you had the chance to see our presentation for healthcare, you saw a tremendous success story from University Health in San Antonio in personal property. And a subtext of this is that we'd like to see that move into the infrastructure. What are the objectives? We want to provide access to healthcare. That's the objective, timely access to healthcare. Can we go to the next slide, please? The desired end state, a real life example is this. There's a tremendous amount of deferred maintenance in infrastructure and in healthcare infrastructure. That's a vulnerability. It causes utility outages and other untoward events. We'd like to reduce those. We'd like to reduce them from the big picture of disciplined asset management as opposed to just throwing money at a problem that emerges. We want to address it from the big picture down and across the entire life cycle of the asset. Anything that occurs in earlier stages of the life cycle can affect it downstream, and we want to address that from the big picture, applying ISO 55K principles with adequate governance to define the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved across the life cycle. And the next slide, please. As I said, ISO 55K supports this by providing the framework and a tremendously disciplined system to manage all the assets, whether it's personal property or infrastructure. As to voluntary consensus and standards, there are a lot of things that could be considered here. In addition to GAO, there are other practical places where we can bring information in to improve performance, ANSI, government regulations, even federal laws. An entity that's not federal may not have to follow those laws, but please consider this. The federal government is right now preparing something called FIBIF, the Federal Integrated Framework for Business. And in FIBIF, there are many standards and capabilities that are identified. We at Grant Thornton have identified over 90 of those capabilities that need to be applied across the life cycle. They are tied to a standard or a best practice. And just one example, in addition to ISO 55K, ISO has 41K, which deals directly with maintenance. So that's something that can be applied to any entity that provides maintenance. And in healthcare, maintenance is crucial because it's a matter of patient safety. The next slide, please. You can read the slide. I'd just like to point out that for those of us that have worked in medical centers, hospitals, they are notoriously political. And one thing we have to face is turf mongering. So this is going to be delicate, and we have to be persistent. In addition to the 5 bullets illustrated there, it's a challenge because it's going to be political. Some folks may not want to let go of real or perceived authority across the life cycle. And I can assure you that if 55K is implemented, those roles, responsibilities, and commensurate authorities across the entire asset life cycle will be well defined, and it will put an end to that. It won't be easy, but San Antonio at University Health has shown that it can be done. The next slide, please. How will that help? For in the most fundamental way, we want to make sure that we minimize untoward incidents like major utility failures, such as electrical outages, the failure of the emergency distribution system to engage, the loss of bulk liquid oxygen. In my career, all of these things have happened, and if we could have taken care of our assets in a better way, they could have been avoided. We also want to avoid the sudden replacement of major utility systems like a chiller. Sometimes we know that some of our systems are nearing failure, whether it's a transformer, an automatic transfer switch, a chiller, but we just can't get the funding in time to replace it. ISO 55K can help identify those vulnerabilities and address them. And another component of that is facility condition assessments, which can in turn provide a facility condition index. One way that we can comply is to raise the index and lower the backlog of facility condition assessment deferred maintenance. And the next slide. I kind of addressed that here. We can set up a baseline by measuring things like the number of unplanned outages, the number of untoward events, sudden major utility component replacements, which are extremely expensive, and the backlog of FCAs and rating of facility condition indexes. We can set a baseline before we implement 55K, monitor it, and measure it after 55K. University Health has shown that there's money to be saved, and to be a little altruistic, in the case of healthcare, there's more than money at stake. It's safety and the lives of the patients that we care for. The next slide. We need to develop a plan. I may be reaching out to some of you, if you're in healthcare, to join us in building the plan. And that's the right thing to do. Besides the success story I've shared with you at University Health, this is the right thing to do. It helps with safety and it can save money. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our host.
So I guess we can open this up for questions if anyone, let's take a look at the chat.
There's one addressed to all the panelists. Does the ISO 55001 4.1 focus on organizational objectives help reduce political infighting?
Well, that's the point that you made, and I think the answer is definitely yes. I mean, it's by defining roles and responsibilities effectively and in a collaborative way, you avoid a lot of the infighting that occurs when all those things are unclear. And Ed, having spent time in VA, I mean, it's like you say, it's going to be quite a cultural challenge to get people to give up roles that they have believed themselves to have, when those roles don't mesh well with the roles that other people have to play. So it's there's a great leadership challenge. One of the things that was successful at the University Health System was they engaged their CFO, their Chief Financial Officer, and then their CEO. So they were able to get the support of key leadership, and that's proven critical in implementing this successfully. The other point I think we can say about the University Health System, although they started with a focus on personal property, they are currently starting to collaborate with their facilities people to expand the scope of their asset management system to include facilities as well as personal property. So one of the things that was wonderful about the past 3 weeks when we had our event was we got to listen to experts from different sectors and learn more about some of the unique aspects of those sectors. They're all at different places, but they have collectively learned a lot that we are sharing on our website. So I urge anybody on this call right now to take a look at the Asset Leadership Network website and go to the events, and you can have access to all the videos of all the presentations made during that 3-week period. And some of them are quite extraordinary. So I think that's all really I have to say. If anybody else wants to chime in and give us any final thoughts, I'm happy to.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate this. I wasn't aware of that Federal Integrated Business Framework. I think that's very interesting. So I just checked it out on the GSA website. And it doesn't seem to be a huge amount of information on that. So I'm guessing it's just in the forming stage, maybe. But I'd be interested in hearing more. In particular, whether it seems like they will reference something like ISO 55000 or in fact, any of the ISO standards. One of the key things I like about ISO 55000 is that it basically, to my mind, collects or actualizes a lot of the other standards. For instance, 31,000, 9,000, 13,000 for that matter, 14,000 for environmental. So I think it could be very, very useful. I don't know what kind of influence anyone might have on GSA to kind of do the logical thing here, but it seems like there's an opportunity here, and I think the framework, the way it's described and the way you guys described it, might be an opportunity to try to advance that.
Bob, if I may, this is Ed speaking, and you're absolutely right. I'd like to share a little bit of the background with you. As it happens, Grant Thornton was involved in helping GSA build the capabilities for facilities management in real property. So we do know about it, and yes, we did try to influence them. We developed those capability statements, and ISO 55K is liberally cited, as well as ISO 41K, and in a lesser way, ISO 9001. All of them are in there, in addition to the GAO, federal statutes, and regulation citations. And the background, Bob, is that the federal government is pushing for shared services. So what they're doing by creating these capability statements for, in this case, real property or infrastructure management, is to have individual agencies measure themselves against the capabilities that are required. Then the agency will have to express and justify whether it believes it can do its own work or it's better off going to a shared service. That'll be a tremendous challenge, but I believe that the great thing that's come out of this is the identification of capabilities that are required to properly manage the asset. It's been delayed with COVID, and real property was one of the latter groups. The first group was finance. And I can share with you that the challenge that I faced in helping them was that there's a tendency to look at the infrastructure through a financial lens instead of looking at it holistically on what it takes to manage. So that'll be something that we'll face as it comes out. And I'm glad you're interested, and I hope the info I shared is useful.
Oh, definitely. Thank you.
I want to follow up on one of the points that Ed made earlier, and that is that he's going to be reaching out to folks to join with the group that is focused on the healthcare sector. And every single one of these sector plans will be best developed if we have wide representation from organizations in that sector, because there's a lot of expertise out there, and we need to get that expertise brought into the conversation about how a particular sector strategic, plan needs to be developed and what it needs to look like.
Jim also pointed out we should share with folks how they can get involved. And right off the bat, I can say on behalf of all our colleagues, contact any of us. Mike, Spence, Jack, myself, Jim, John, please do. Feel free. We'd love to get your involvement.
Question is, do you think that the SALs can be supportive to that FIBR that Ed mentioned?
FIBF, FIBF.
Yeah, I think so. I think what the sector plans, the SALs do is, like we said, dig into each sector and kind of identify the nuances that are apparent in each sector.
I want to also, let me sort of expand on another comment that Ed made, and that is that, and this is one thing we learned from a number of organizations that have been certified to ISO 55001, and that is you don't have to focus on all of your assets at once. In fact, the most successful implementations that I'm aware of have focused on the assets that are most critical to achieving their mission success. And then what they do is they focus on those assets, and what you understand about ISO 55000, it's more than just the assets, it's the entire organization. It's how all of the management functions of an organization, the administrative functions, the operational functions of an organization have to be organized in a way where they work well with one another to achieve the organization's objectives. And it's that comprehensive organizational approach to asset management that's the key to success for ISO 55000. And it's a lot of organizations think it's just about maintenance and reliability, and it's not. I mean, that's an important part of the day-to-day management of assets, but it's not enough to implement a true asset management system. So as I mentioned at the outset, implementing an asset management system effectively is going to help an organization achieve its objectives, and that's what it's all about.
So Ed, can you address how ISO 55001 4.1, the objectives might help address the political issues that you encountered through your career?
Yeah, I don't have 4.1 memorized, but I can still say how ISO 55K can address it.
The strategic asset management plan shall support organizational objectives. It's basically saying mission focus. Yes. I didn't use the word governance when I was speaking from the slides. One of the components in implementing ISO 55K is to have governance that sets the roles and responsibilities for each function across the life cycle, from requirements to design to delivery, acquisition, delivery, O&M, activation, and disposal. When those functions are defined, governance or executive leadership makes decisions about what offices are responsible for the function and have the authority to execute the function with decision making. So by definition, if entity A thinks it's responsible for delivery, but it's really not, and has previously been exercising perceived authority in delivery, when the governance structure is made, if executive leadership has made a commitment to hold to it, then it's going to put an end to it. And it won't be easy, because people will try to hold on to authority and power. I certainly have seen it in VA and central office. It's really difficult. It's just a fact of life. So I would say the bigger the organization and the more complex and the more political, the harder it will be to implement, but it can be done. And on that note, if I may, Jack, I'd kind of like to tag on to what you said about breaking it into pieces
to address 55K. Let's say you know your electrical distribution system is in horrible shape. Well, you could start with transformers. Yes, they're tied to the ATSs and the panel boards and the step-down transformers. They are. But one could start there, at least a start, so that you could show what could be done. And I didn't mean to go off the track, but I wanted to add that because when one steps back and looks at the problems in infrastructure, they can look huge. They can look insurmountable when you just look at the big picture. But we can start to take pieces of it. And I want to make sure I answered the question about breaking down those political barriers. If not, please let me know.
Thanks, Ed.
Bob Leach, you are involved with entities that are dealing with transformers. People from your group have done that, haven't they?
In particular, the Corps of Engineers, of course, Civil Works, their hydropower folks, the Bureau of Reclamation, their hydropower folks. That's an example of something that's got some of those transformers are huge and that they deal with in their switch yards and things like that. And they have tremendous lead times up to 2 years, for manufacturing alone, never mind delivery. So it's not something that they keep in a storeroom necessarily. And actually that's a big focus of their asset management programs, is to make sense of that in a way where they're not overstrapping the government. They're not sitting on all these things in inventory that require maintenance while they're in inventory, and yet balancing that against these long lead times and the risk of losing one of those things. There's a tremendous potential impact to the grid if those go down.
I find it so interesting that y'all are talking about transformers, because one of the people who came and spoke to us several years ago, in fact, I think it was at your assistance, Bob, was Mark Gabriel, the CEO of the Western Area Power Administration. And he was the Western Area Power Administration, or WAPA, is an example, a rare example of an organization where senior leadership was committed to asset management from the outset, not where somebody who, like Bob, within the Corps had to sell his leadership on the value of asset management. Mark came in being ready to implement asset management right away. And so when he set up his asset management shop, he instructed them to use ISO 55000 and implement an asset management system that was compliant with that standard. And the very first asset type that they focused on to implement the asset management system was transformers. And it took them probably a couple of years to actually put in place an ISO compliant asset management system focused on transformers. But then the next year they came in and talked to us about it, and they said, well, now that we've gotten all the hard stuff, the non-asset related stuff ironed out, we're ready to expand the scope of the assets covered by our asset management system. And so they added breakers and distribution lines. And then they came the following year and came in and said, well, now that we've done that, we are, in the future, we intend to take our asset management system and expand it to cover all of our assets, which is, that sounds like a really smart way to proceed to me.
And may I point out the excellent comment that Art Kurland made about not only starting with a particular asset class, but one could start in a function or phase of the life cycle. Art, I couldn't agree with you more. I'd like to give a practical example of that. As those of you who work with the federal government know, GSA makes a lot of inquiries, a lot of data calls. They once made a data call to VA about leasing, and multiple offices were attempting to present themselves as in charge of leasing. So yes, we could certainly start with one, and that would be helpful.
There was a question for someone wanted to see the taxonomy slide in slightly more detail. Jonathan, do you think you could throw that up, and maybe Spence, you could talk about it or something like that?
Yeah, so here's the taxonomy slide. So it kind of goes down: form, domain, classification, order, and family. It's kind of all encompassing because these sector plans will be not just affecting physical, but also non-physical entities and assets. So is there a specific question regarding the taxonomy?
So the key thing about this, so this was developed for the National Asset Leadership Strategy last year, and it's basically a way to characterize all of the assets that exist basically. But when you get into a sector, what's important is you focus, you really get down to the type level. You're talking about, for example, in law enforcement, you might be talking about, well, as we mentioned before, motor vehicles. You'd be talking about various kinds of physical equipment to support law enforcement. You can talk about, surveillance equipment, drones and aircraft, things like that. So the specific assets that are going to be critical to the success of a particular sector are going to be in most cases unique to that sector, or at least a lot of the assets will be unique to that sector.
Jonathan, can you comment on this and then also the stakeholder slide?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, it's taking a second to get off mute there. And I think to add on what Jack was saying, I think the purpose of this is to provide that framework, like we said with the nows, is to provide the framework to kind of the high level, how we would break down the taxonomy, and then, within the sectors, really digging into the types, like Jack said, fleet, thinking of law enforcement, fleet, weapons, or body armor, or just kind of dig into the individual pieces of equipment, and kind of using this framework to slice and dice the different types of assets you're working with in the sector.
And then the federal law enforcement strategic asset leadership success structure might just focus on fleet, or it might just focus on body armor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't have to be everything in law enforcement. I'll let you talk about that. We kind of want to let other sectors understand it doesn't have to be all encompassing.
What happens is, a lot of people look at this and they get overwhelmed because there seems like there's so much to know and so much to do. But in reality, if you start with a basic question, what is my organization here to do? And of those various things we're here to do, what are the most important things we need to do? If we don't do this, then we don't need to exist, or we're likely not to exist. So once you've honed in on the most important objectives of your organization, then it's not a very big leap to say, okay, so let's talk about the assets that are critical to achieving those objectives. And that will start focusing your attention in a useful way right off the bat. It's, if you come at it the other way and say, what are all the assets I own? And, you can end up asking questions that don't really matter for a long time. So you want to ask the questions that matter first. The second thing is, and this is one of the beauties of ISO 55000, particularly 55001, the requirements, you do what they call a gap analysis. You say ISO 55001 requirements are the basic requirements that an organization with an effective asset management system is expected to meet. Now, you've got to have certain kinds of plans. You've got to have good communications. You've got to have clear lines of authority. So all of these, basically common sense, good management characteristics. And then if you assess where your organization is compared to where the standard says you should be in terms of meeting requirements, then where you don't meet the requirements, that's a gap. And the next thing you do once you've completed a gap analysis is you come up with essentially a corrective action plan. How do we close the gaps? Which gaps are most important to close first? And it takes work, but it's a very easily understood and organized way to kind of get yourself from where you are to where you ought to be and where you want to be in order to be successful.
And can we look at the stakeholder slide in a little more detail too? Because you're saying who, so let's talk about who is doing these things. Can you zoom in a little?
Yep. So what this slide does is it divides basically it's divides the world into the public sector and the private sector. The reason is that within the private sector, we kind of understand who the customers are. They're government agencies basically, and those are the asset owners and operators. I'm in the public sector now. So asset owners and operators in the public sector are federal, state, and local agencies, basically. We make a distinction between the people that actually own or operate assets and the people who influence how that's done. Within the federal government, the major influences are Congress through legislation, the executive branch policymaking agencies like OMB, where I used to work, and then grant-making agencies whose regulations on how grants are issued can be, and sometimes are, conditioned on whether or not the grantees exhibit an asset management plan, for example. So you can have, so those are people in the federal government who can influence how the federal agencies actually manage their assets. And in the case of the grant making agencies, how state and local agencies manage their assets. And then of course, you've got, at the state, county, and municipal levels, they have their own legislatures. They may have grant making agencies, and they often have regulators. The other thing that where this is different from the first version that we produced when we did the NALs, is we recognize that in the first version, we had forgotten beneficiaries, because there are a lot of people who benefit from government action. They're sort of they're the public sector equivalent of customers on the private sector side. And they are critical in terms of making sure that what you're operating benefits people, basically.
We just had a question or two come in. The first question would be, what is the path to an acceptable maturity model to enable comparisons between entities or sectors regarding ISO 55000 progress? I don't know who wants to field that.
That's a great question. So and what I said earlier about a gap analysis, the gap analysis tells you how close you are to meeting the requirements of the standard. There are, I don't remember them exactly, but there are, in fact, ways to assess asset management maturity and measure where you are on a certain scale. And I just forget the mechanics of that. So some other folks on the call might remember that better than I do. But I have seen asset management maturity models where you can see an organization is kind of, when it's just getting started, it's at a low point in its maturity, and then as it progresses over time, it gets to higher and higher points. I want to go back to another thing Art Curlin said in his presentation, because I thought it was really cool. What he said was, people ask him what are the benefits that the hospital has realized from being certified. And one of the things he said stuck with me, and I hope I remember it correctly. And he said, one, the problem for them initially was they didn't really have good benchmark data. That was one of the things that they realized when they actually started putting their asset management plan and their asset management system in place. And so right away, there were certain things that they couldn't measure, but now they've put the metrics in place and they can kind of track how they're doing. The other thing that I think I remember him saying was that one of the biggest advantages of implementing the standard was improved communications across all the different management silos. He said, people that hadn't talked to each other for years were now routinely conversing on what needed to be done. And so that changing the culture from a kind of a typical organization where you've got all these silos or cylinders of excellence, I think one of our panelists on the conference said, from that to actually organizations that collaborate across those cylinders of excellence. And that's something that clearly an organization feels when it does it.
Hey, Ed, do you want to comment on this question that was asked about the path to an acceptable maturity model?
Just to add to what Jack said, at Grant Thornton, we actually have developed a maturity model. It goes across the whole life cycle, identifying what is needed to, as we put it, be mature. And it's holistic and evidence-driven. It asks questions so that one can rate the maturity that one has in asset management. Be happy to share more information offline if interested. We have developed that, and please keep in mind that part of 55K is to have KPIs so that we can measure what we're doing, and that's included in the framework that we have developed.
Thanks, Ed. And Bob Leach, if you're still around, do you have any interest in fielding an answer to this question about path to an acceptable maturity model?
I don't know that I have any more to offer. In fact, I've been interested in hearing some of these answers because I wasn't aware of, for instance, the ASTM maturity model. I know there's some other ones out there. The one I'm most familiar with is focused on the ISO 55039 areas of competency, but I don't think that necessarily focuses in on this particular area that we're talking about here. So that's my answer.
So one of our, Robert Kaufman, one of our panelists, took that cylinders of excellence metaphor that I talked about, which is I have to attribute to Alex Fahrenblatt from LMI. He said, cylinders of excellence need to be turned on their sides to become pipelines of communication. I love that. Well, thank you all for joining us. We are really excited about this sector-based approach to implementing asset management. And one of the things that there are two things that I can think of that are going to be critical to our ability to do that. One is getting people from the different sectors to participate on those sector teams, because we need as much participation and expertise involved in those conversations as possible. And the other thing is, to the extent that some of y'all or some of the experts that we bring to the table have links into the political process or the political sphere, if you will. In other words, you know people in congressional staffs involved in your sector. That can be very helpful, because we need to open up communications between the asset owners and operators and the influencers. And some of the key influencers, certainly in the government space, are congressional staffers or members of Congress. So I urge y'all to be thinking about that as you start thinking about how to engage on this. And if you have any connections that can be helpful to this effort, please let us know.
Yeah, with that, thank you so much for letting us speak here today. And I think Ed mentioned it. Feel free to reach out to any one of us if you want to get involved. More the merrier, I think.
Yeah, to echo John, thanks for everybody for attending and listening. We would let as many people as we can get to work on these sector plans, because the more heads together, the better it can be.
And I'll just close by saying we all really appreciate you sharing your time with us. We respect your time and glad you gave us a chance. Thank you.
Thanks for hosting, Jack. See you guys next week, maybe.
Adios.
ALN Thursday at 4.
Okay.
Alrighty. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.